The transgender craze is growing and metastasizing in America and worldwide. Confusion is abounding. On Season 2 of Generation Indoctrination, we're bringing you the powerful audio version of the new ebook, Exposing the Gender Lie: How to Protect Children and Teens from the Transgender Industry's False Ideology. In the book, Summit Ministries President Dr. Jeff Myers and Christian Post reporter Brandon Showalter explore the diabolical nature of the movement and how to stop this ideology from continuing to wreak havoc. This is Chapter 4.
Chapter 4. How Trans Ideology Captured Our Institutions. Quote, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ." Unquote. Colossians 2:8. As we noted in Chapter 2, gender ideology did not emerge suddenly. Gender ideology activists have been working for years to control the presentation of transgender in education and medicine. In this chapter, we will focus on both issues, beginning with the medicalization of gender identity issues. As we will see, committees that establish standards for transgender medicine at the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the Endocrine Society have attempted to transform the debate by deeming it medically necessary for transgender patients, even minors, to undergo treatments with puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries until they achieve comfort with their gender identity. Quotation marks around these terms, medically necessary and comfort, are now square quotes. These terms are used in the standards of care developed for the treatment of patients experiencing gender confusion. Medical necessity is an important designation. Insurance companies must cover such procedures. Medicare and Medicaid must cover them, using taxpayer dollars. If transgender medicine is not deemed medically necessary, few people will be able to afford it, and the massive profits anticipated by the medical industrial complex will evaporate. In countries such as Finland, where much of transgender medicine was pioneered, the medical community has backed away from drugs and surgery as the primary treatment options and recommended psychological counseling instead. The financial toll may have been an underlying cause of the decision, but the expressed reasoning is that gender dysphoria is a disease of the mind, not of the body. In the United States, however, gender ideology activists have dominated the discussion, leaving medical providers with few options if they want to properly treat those struggling with gender identity disorders. An international group of doctors organized as the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, citing admissions from medical associations themselves, says that gender ideology activists have so thoroughly dominated the discussion that alternative views are not permitted. There are no debates. Transgender standards of care, they say, are designed by people who always and only support one position, that the ethical gender-affirming care must encourage adults and minors to socially and medically transition to their preferred gender. In short, transgender medicine has become politicized. Sadly, this is common in many areas of science and medicine. Activists draw conclusions that are to their liking and then publicly promote a particular point of view as being the scientific consensus. Trust the science, they say. Those who take issue with their interpretation are called science deniers. Our view is that everyone loses when politicians and activists attempt to force a consensus as a means of achieving desired policy outcomes. It is important to acknowledge that scientific discovery is a human enterprise and thus fallible. For example, in 2011, researchers at Bayer looked at 67 recent drug discovery projects and found that 75% could not be replicated in their in-house laboratories. Only 11% of preclinical cancer research reports studied by reviewers could be validated. It is not that failure in science is bad. Indeed, failure is one of the things that makes science valuable. The best scientific research takes place when researchers develop a hypothesis and then work to disprove it. Only when efforts to disprove it have failed is it tentatively accepted. One might say that the scientific process involves the intentional pursuit of failure for the sake of knowledge. The existence of politicized science does not mean we ought to ignore scientific studies. Rather, we ought to understand what science is and does, what its underlying assumptions are, and how to keep it from falling victim to political malpractice. This means we must carefully and compassionately explore how transgender medicine turned the gender ideology debate into a promotion of a pharmaceutical and surgical approach. Even smart medical professionals cannot know everything about every malady. To give guidance on treatment options, standards of care are developed by committees of people in the medical industry. these standards are designed to both guide the treatment of patients and to provide a level of protection from legal liability. If taken to court, doctors can defend themselves by arguing that they were following the standards that represent the best practices recommended by experts. Standards of care are a double-edged sword, however. Reasonable doctors may disagree with the recommended standards for a variety of reasons. But if the standards are politically derived, this can put them in a precarious position. Say a doctor thinks that counseling, rather than pharmaceuticals and surgery, ought to be pursued for a teenager diagnosed with gender dysphoria. If the patient or the patient's parents are unhappy with the diagnosis, or if the patient subsequently engages in self-harm, would the doctor be legally liable for not following the recommended standards of care? Would that doctor face censure from medical associations that have developed those recommendations? Are they merely recommendations when they carry the threat of legal liability, loss of licensure, or public censure? These are open questions surrounding care for people experiencing gender dysphoria. The standards of care themselves insist that the proper term for such treatment is gender affirming. This is a rhetorical move, not a medical one. It makes it seem unreasonable for medical professionals to reach any other conclusion than that a patient's subjective experience of gender must be affirmed by moving them toward whatever medical remedy is necessary to make them feel comfortable. A similar manufacturing of consensus happened with opioids. Pushed by the pharmaceutical industry, standards of care were developed to treat pain itself as a disease. We now know that the easy availability and presumed safeness of opioids led many doctors to write prescriptions for painkillers rather than pursue other pain management solutions such as physical therapy that are much more expensive and time-consuming. It is hard to hold doctors accountable for this. Unless they were wantonly irresponsible, it is very difficult to prove that their prescribing habits violated the standards of care. This difference between prescribing opioids and transgender medicine is that if activists have their way, doctors who fail to follow the transition regimen with patients who could potentially open them up for claims of malpractice. The first shot has already been fired. An article in the City University of New York Law Review calls on the New York State Assembly to give trans adults the right to sue doctors who denied them gender-affirming care as youths. The article claims that doctors have a duty to educate unsupportive parents about the medical consensus that transitioning is the only effective treatment. Later in this chapter, we will discuss where the transgender medicine standards of care originated. Being charitable, we can say that the committees that developed them started with a concern that LGBTQ identifying people were not receiving adequate health care, either because of discrimination or because of embarrassment about the medical implications of their sexual behavior. Starting in the early 2000s, gender ideology activists began working to ensure that one, and only one, treatment path for gender dysphoria would be considered gender affirming, and that such care is medically necessary. The World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPATH, Standards of Care for the Health of Transgender and Diverse People, version 8, is a 48-page document instructing medical providers to interact with gender-questioning patients in accordance with their preferred gender. Then, and the authors state this repeatedly and leave no doubt as to their intention, it is recommended that doctors prescribe medical interventions to the comfort level of patients. The authors say, quote, "To conclude, although the existing samples reported on relatively small groups of youth and the time of follow-up varied across studies, 6 months to 7 years, this emerging evidence base indicates a general improvement in the lives of transgender adolescents who, following careful assessment, receive medically necessary gender-affirming medical treatment." Unquote. It is important to understand what is being said here. The authors admit that there is very little evidence for their approach or for its long-term efficacy, yet they insist that medical treatment is necessary. To foster an impression that their recommended approach to transgender medicine is based on evidence, the authors of the Transgender Medical Standards of Care publish a journal in the International Journal of Transgenderism. The journal's description asserts that, until now, the lack of evidence for their point of view was the result of subjugation and oppression, rather than any inherent flaw in their approach to the issue. So what do the Transgender Medicine Standards of Care say? We have included a link so that you can read the document and see whether our conclusions are warranted. The natural outcome of gender-affirming care, according to these standards of care, is pharmaceutical interventions such as puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, as well as surgeries until the patient becomes comfortable with the relationship between their sex and gender. The only ways gender-affirming treatment would not become medicalized would be, 1, if the doctor interrupts it, a risky career move that could lead to liability exposure, 2, If the patient interrupts the treatment, unlikely, given that people generally trust their medical providers, desire relief, and take comfort in the possibility that their dysphoria can be resolved medically. Or 3, in the case of patients who are minors, if a parent interrupts the treatment, also unlikely, given the fear of social sanction or even the possibility that their refusal would be seen as abuse. Because of the rapidly growing number of people claiming gender dysphoria, every general practitioner in America will sooner or later face this issue with patients. Again, we say in America because the American approach to transgender medicine is quite unique. In parts of the world where sick people have a hard time getting access to basic life-saving health care, treating gender dysphoria is not a priority. In other parts of the world, such as Finland and the United Kingdom, the medical community has backtracked on the medicalization of gender dysphoria, especially with minors. What happens when a treatment protocol such as that governing gender dysphoria becomes politicized? The experience of respected figures in the psychological field, such as J. Michael Bailey, Kenneth Zucker, and James Caspian, is instructive. All have borne the wrath of gender ideology activists. Within the last several years, each of these professionals have had their reputations tarnished, their families harassed and doxxed, their research and scholarship misrepresented, and their clinics shut down. An example of the blatant politicization of transgender care is that the American Academy of Pediatrics, which was heavily influenced by gender ideology activists when they published their 2016 guidelines on care for children who identify as the opposite sex. America's largest LGBTQ rights group, the Human Rights Campaign, took a leading role in co-authoring the AAP's professional guidelines on care for transgender-identifying children. In fact, the lead author of those guidelines was a 25-year-old trans-identified female who is not a doctor. Out of the 12 authors whose names appeared on the official guidelines, only 5 were physicians. Though 66,000 pediatricians are members of the AAP, less than 30 people designed the guidelines for transgender care, according to Dr. Marian Rutigliano, an internal medicine doctor from Baltimore and an expert in toxic chemicals. One of the contributors to the guidelines included a physician who was the director of a transgender health clinic, at which 100% of the children who came in were considered, quote, appropriate for transition, unquote. A similar ideological takeover happened within the Endocrine Society. In the late 2000s, Dr. Quentin Van Meter, a pediatric endocrinologist from Atlanta and an outspoken critic of experimental medicalization in the treatment of gender dysphoria, recalled hearing a presentation by Dr. Norman Spack. At a combined gathering of the European Endocrine Society and the American Endocrine Society, Dr. Van Meter was appalled by what he heard Spack call solid science. There was no solid science, but it was not in a forum where I was comfortable raising my hand saying, "Excuse me, but where did you make up this crap?" It wasn't my modus operandi, and I just thought, well, this is a crazy person. This isn't going anywhere, Van Meter told the Christian Post in 2018. Little did he know that Spack, who opened the first ever U.S. pediatric gender clinic in Boston in 2007, would be among those who would engineer revisions to the official guidelines for the Endocrine Society regarding gender dysphoria in children. These new professional directives were a game changer. Quote, when the 2009 guidelines were published, they were astonishingly devoid of science. They were mostly recommended on hopeful thinking, unquote, Van Meter said. In subsequent years, the guidelines have become increasingly medicalized. The Endocrine Society's guidelines were revised again in 2017 and became even more oriented around prioritizing medicalized gender transition than the 2009 version. They argued for starting patients on cross-sex hormones earlier while minimizing the need for a psychological evaluation of the child. In fact, Van Meter explained, the guidelines began urging the psychological training of parents to accept the experimental medical transition as the route to a new destiny for their child. Companies that make puberty blockers and cross-sex synthetic hormones and medical providers offering surgical services stand to make a great deal of money from current trends. But this will not happen without customers. To accept the medicalization of gender identity struggles, impressionable minds must be convinced that gender is at the core of their identity struggles, and that medicine can successfully turn them from being a boy to a girl, or vice versa. Ground zero for this unprecedented social experiment is the education system. As of this writing, in early 2023, parents have been awakening to the reality that gender ideology has become commonplace in schools. Just as with dominant medical associations, activists have asserted control over teachers' unions with the goal of mandating gender ideology in the classroom. Abigail Schreier documents in Irreversible Damage that in January 2019, the policy wing of California Teachers Association met to decide on a number of matters, including new business item number 6/19-12, which was a proposal to allow trans-identified minor students to leave campus in order to obtain hormones without parental permission. Delegates approved the measure. A year later, the CTA's Civil Rights and Education Subcommittee went so far as to move to create school-based healthcare clinics that would provide, quote, cisgender, transgender, and non-binary youth equal and confidential access to a broad range of physical, mental, and behavioral services, unquote. As egregious as these policies and proposals are in terms of violating the parent-child relationship, most disturbing are the doubts sown into the minds of students with cult-like indoctrination at the very age when their cognitive faculties are learning how to test reality. Schreier continues, quote, in schools across America, kindergartners are taught that biological sex and gender very often come apart. One has no essential connection to the other. There are some people for whom gender identity aligns perfectly with the sex they were assigned at birth. Cisgender, they are called, meaning on this side of gender, coined to be the definitional opposite of transgender, meaning across from gender. As it is presented in schools, cisgender often means to be a null set. Faced with a heaping buffet of gender identities to choose from, it's hard to imagine everyone isn't a little bit something. Girls who like math or sports or are logical, boys who sing or act or like to draw are all gender nonconforming. They may have turned up at school as a girl who excels at math or boy with vocal talent, but they leave rebranded as a person whose behaviors or gender expression falls outside what is generally considered typical for their sex assigned at birth. Unquote. In many schools, what used to be called gay-straight alliance clubs have morphed into gender and sexuality alliance student groups. Students struggling with their gender identity are encouraged to join so that they can be affirmed in their struggles. In addition to extracurricular groups, teachers in many places are instructed to daily or weekly ask students about their gender identity and to state their preferred pronouns. However silly this all might seem to average people, activists are completely serious about the ideology they espouse. An infamous flyer created by the group Trans Student Educational Resources shows a cartoon unicorn called the Gender Unicorn that purports to redefine what human beings are while employing genderist euphemisms and phrases. Emerging from this unicorn's head is a thought bubble containing a rainbow that is said to represent gender identity, though what is circularly defined as whatever gender with which a person might identify. The unicorn is shown having two hearts, presumably representing the various emotional attractions to men, women, or other genders. In the cartoon unicorn's crotch area is a double helix of a DNA strand, which represents the creature's sex assigned at birth, according to the document, which may be male, female, or other intersex. Sex, of course, is not assigned by any doctor or anyone else. It is stamped in the DNA from the moment of fertilization. Regarding intersex, it is not surprising that it is listed as a kind of third sex when it is not. It is often used by trans activists to cast doubt on the dimorphous nature of human sexuality. Intersex people exist, is an argument often used by gender ideology activists to trump all other arguments. In the way it is used, this argument is false. The scientific truth is that a tiny percentage of the human population may have a rare chromosomal configuration that is neither XX nor XY. Klinefelter's and Turner syndrome are two examples of these genetic anomalies. These are often called disorders of sexual development, DSDs, or intersex condition. Every person who is born with a DSD, which may or may not manifest in an unusual appearance of one's secondary sex characteristics, is always either male or female. There are only eggs and sperm. There is no third gamete, no third sex. But this does not stop gender ideology activists from conflating DSDs with gender identity, the latter of which is entirely a self-declared identity construct and not genetic. Moreover, the groups that represent people with intersex conditions have objected to the co-opting of intersex persons by the gender ideology agenda. The Intersex Society of North America has stated they are not, quote, not seeking a genderless society or to label themselves as a member of a third gender class. Even as gender ideologues conflate two unrelated ideas under the umbrella of gender diversity, gender identity activists go further, declaring that one's gender is a phenomenon that occurs from within themselves and that it can only be known by the sovereign self. As Mary Rice Hasson and Teresa Farnan write in their book, Get Out Now, Why You Should Pull Your Child from Public School Before It's Too Late, activists bent on rejecting reality are overhauling classroom instruction, moving from education to indoctrination. Citing a 2017 report from a coalition of influential LGBTQ activist groups and their allies in the National Education Association, the authors point out that the organizations have defined transgender person as those, quote, whose sex assigned at birth is different from the gender they know they are on the inside, unquote. The result of this ideological crusade is that the education system and increasingly government bureaucracies will no longer take account of biological sex, an existential reality in the life of every person. As we saw in an earlier chapter, the gender ideology debate has created a war on language itself, using words to uncouple personal psychological states from the nature of reality. The reality is that nearly every cell in the body is male or female. Psychology cannot change this. Yet gender ideologues persist in creating a fiction that causes children to question the very nature of reality. A particularly illuminating moment occurred regarding the strategy of gender activists when a document that was shared with journalist James Kirkup of The Spectator in 2019 from Denton's, which claims to be the largest law firm in the world, the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer, and Intersex Youth and Student Organization. The document, titled Only Adults, Good Practices in Legal Gender Recognition for Youth, exposed the tactics that gender ideology activists use to accomplish their policy aims, including how government entities should override parental rights so they no longer have legal control over their children on issues pertaining to gender. Although both Denton's and the Thomson Reuters Foundation noted that the document does not necessarily reflect their viewpoints, it nevertheless advises that, quote, states should take action against parents who are obstructing the free development of a young trans person's identity in refusing to give parental authorization when required, unquote. The document also urged gender ideology activist groups to wed themselves to politically popular initiatives, such as marriage equality bills, which provided a veil of protection, particularly in countries, quote, where marriage equality was strongly supported, but gender identity remained a more difficult issue to win public support for, unquote. Given the pervasiveness of transgender messaging in the media and social media as well as in the medical community and educational system, it has become increasingly difficult to imagine that things could ever change. It feels like medical experimentation on confused children will only continue to grow, and children struggling with their gender identity will continue to be further confused by the messaging they receive from trusted authorities. We believe that the truth will ultimately prevail, but we also need to contend for it in the public domain. Part of the fight is understanding the misleading and underhanded nature of the gender identity agenda. We fight with statistics and stories. For believers, though, it is also important to understand why we believe what we believe about sexuality and gender. For this, we need to turn our attention to how a biblical worldview brings clarity with these confusing issues.
Thank you for listening. Go over to the show notes to see how you can download Exposing the Gender Lie, How to Protect Children and Teens from the Transgender Industry's False Ideology ebook free from the Christian Post. And be sure to find out more about Dr. Jeff Myers and Summit Ministries at summit.org.